Okay, let's unpack this. Societies are incredible, aren't they? They're not just, static things.
Not at all. They're constantly in motion.
Exactly. Adapting, sometimes colliding. And we're about to plunge into a really fascinating period in early Indian history, roughly 600 BCE to 600 CE.
A long stretch of time, about 1,200 years.
And it was an era of big shifts, right? Economic, political.
Definitely. You see new towns popping up, states forming, different ways of living emerging, and all these changes, they had pretty profound effects on how people organize themselves, on social structures.
It's a dynamic period for sure. New power centers, trade networks expanding.
Uh-huh. And all that puts pressure, on the traditional ways of structuring relationships and identity.
Right. So our mission today is to take a deep dive into how kinship, caste, and class actually worked in these early societies.
And we've got a fantastic set of sources to guide us.
Yeah, quite a stag. Everything from the epic scope of the Mahabharata to the more prescriptive texts like the Dharma Sutras and Manusmriti.
Plus archaeological finds, historical inscriptions.
Yeah.
It's a rich mix.
It is. But these sources are our windows, right? And like any window, the view depends on where you're standing.
That's a great way to put it. They come with their own complexities. Some texts are definitely trying to lay down the law, telling people how they should live.
The ideal.
The ideal, yes.
Mhm.
While others are describing situations or telling stories that might actually, challenge those very norms.
So understanding the source itself is crucial. Who wrote it? Why? Who are they writing for?
Absolutely essential. You have
Yeah.
to consider the perspective if you want to navigate this history properly.
Couldn't agree more. So get ready. We'll look at legendary family feuds, some surprising truths about ancient marriage.
The layers of social hierarchy.
Right, and how things like wealth and access to resources really shaped a person's place in the world.
There are definitely some aha moments in store, I think, as we explore how identities and relationships were defined, and maybe more importantly, how they were contested.
Yeah, the contesting part is key. Let's dive into the sources then.
Let's do it.
All right, so starting with our source material. Historians looking at early Indian history face a challenge right off the bat, don't they? Because many of the most prominent texts, well, they come from a specific viewpoint.
That's right. A significant chunk of the early texts, especially the Sanskrit ones, were composed by Brahmanas, or at least for a Brahmana audience.
So naturally, they reflect a Brahmanical perspective on how society ought to be structured.
Exactly. And early historians, relying heavily on these texts, sometimes, perhaps understandably, took them almost at face value, as literal descriptions of how everyone lived everywhere.
Which is a starting point, but maybe a bit too simple.
Well, yeah. As later scholars dug deeper, they started looking at other textual traditions, texts in Pali, Prakrit, Tamil,
Uh-huh.
and these other sources often show something different. They show that while those normative Sanskrit texts were known, they weren't just passively accepted across the board.
People questioned them, debated them.
Yes, and often real-life practices look quite different from the rules laid down in those texts.
So this is really fundamental historical method stuff, isn't it?
It is. For you, the listener, it's just vital to always keep asking, who created this text? Why? A set of rules written for, say, a king or a high-status family.
Might tell you very little about the daily life of a farmer.
Or a merchant or someone living in a forest community. Their social understanding could be entirely different.
Okay. And speaking of major texts, we absolutely have to talk about the Mahabharata. It's just,
But
it's colossal.
it really is. In the form we have it today, it's over 100,000 verses. Think about that.
That's staggering.
And likely compiled over maybe 1,000 years, starting around 500 BCE, perhaps.
And at its core, everyone knows the main story, right? The feud between the Kauravas and the Pandavas.
Those warring cousins, yes, locked in this epic battle for power. But woven all through that main narrative are these extensive sections on social norms, ethics, how people should behave.
But this huge saga that also contains, like, mini treatises on society embedded within it.
That's a good way to think about it. And what's really fascinating and important for us is how the characters in the story sometimes act in ways that completely contradict the norms described in those didactic teaching parts of the text.
Ah, okay. So for you listening, that's a great question to keep in mind as we go through some of these stories. What does it signify when the characters follow the rules? And maybe more revealingly, when do they deviate? And what does the text seem to say about those deviations? Does it condemn them, explain them, ignore them?
That internal complexity, those tensions, are part of what makes the epic so rich and enduring. And trying to understand the Mahabharata in all its different versions led to this incredible scholarly project.
The critical edition. Tell us about that. It sounds like a monumental task.
It absolutely was. It
Yeah.
started back in 1919, led by V.S. Sukhthankar. The goal was ambitious, to produce a kind of standardized critical text of the epic
How did they even begin to do that?
by collecting Sanskrit manuscripts from literally everywhere, all corners of the subcontinent, from Kashmir up north down to Kerala and Tamil Nadu in the south.
Just gathering them must have been a huge undertaking.
Oh, undoubtedly. And then came the really painstaking work, comparing them, verse by verse, sometimes word by word. The editors identified the verses that were common to most of the versions they found.
Okay, so finding the common core.
Exactly. That formed the basis of the main published text.
And how long did this whole process take?
Get this, 47 years to complete.
Wow. Almost half a century.
And the final result, over 13,000 pages. But here's the part that really jumps out, the crucial bit for understanding the text's nature. More than half of those thousands of pages are dedicated just to documenting the variations found in the different manuscripts.
Wait, hang on. More pages on the variations than on the main text itself.
That's right. Think about what that tells you.
It tells me this wasn't some single fixed book from the start. It was alive, changing.
Precisely. While there was clearly a shared core story, a tradition recognized across vast distances, those enormous regional variations show that the Mahabharata was constantly being adapted, retold, added to, modified. It was reflecting local ideas, local practices, local perspectives.
So reading it isn't like reading one author's vision. It's more like eavesdropping on this long, complex conversation happening across India over centuries. Full of agreements, yes, but also disagreements, different takes.
That's a perfect analogy. Those variations are concrete evidence of that dynamic interplay, that dialogue between the big overarching traditions like the Brahmanical norms we mentioned and the diverse local realities they encountered. A process of give and take, maybe conflict, maybe consensus building.
Okay. So when historians like you approach texts like this with all these layers, all these variations, what's the toolkit? How do you make sense of it all?
Well, you need a critical approach, definitely. As our source material lays out later, you have to look at several things. The language, for instance. Is it high-flown Vedic Sanskrit, or is it a simpler Sanskrit, or maybe Prakrit, Pali, Tamil? That tells you something about the intended audience.
And the type of text matters too, right? Ritual versus story.
Exactly. Is it a mantra meant for a specific ritual? Is it a narrative story? Is it a set of legal or social rules? Each needs to be read differently.
And then there's the author, or authors.
Crucial. Identifying who likely wrote it, what their perspective or social position might have been, and who are they writing for? What was their intended audience?
And finally, placing it in time and space.
Yes. Figuring out the likely date and place of composition, or when major additions were made. All that provides essential historical context.
Okay, let's try applying that toolkit to the Mahabharata itself. The language you mentioned is a bit simpler than the Vedas.
Right, the Sanskrit is generally more accessible. That suggests it was probably intended for, or at least understood by, a wider audience than just, say, ritual specialists.
And historians often divide the content into narrative and didactic.
Yes, the stories versus the teachings or norms. Though, in practice, they're often really interwoven. It helps analytically, though, to distinguish them.
And the sense is that the didactic parts, the teachings, were maybe added later.
That's the general scholarly consensus, yes. The core narrative, the dramatic story, is likely older. The sections laying out social norms, philosophy, religious ideas, those seem to have been incorporated and expanded over a long period.
The text calls itself an itihasa. What does that actually mean?
Literally something like thus it was. It's often translated as history.
Which, of course, raises the big question.
Yeah.
Was there a real war? The epic describes this absolutely massive conflict.
And that's a huge point of debate among historians. Some scholars see the epic as preserving the memory, however embellished, of actual conflicts that took place between kin groups in the Kuru Panchala region of northern India.
But others are more skeptical.
Yes. Others point out that there's a lack of strong corroborating evidence from archaeology or other contemporary texts for a single war of the immense scale and significance described in the epic, happening exactly when it's supposed to have happened.
So the specific historical event might be debatable, but the text itself is undeniably real. And it tells us so much about the ideas, the concerns, the values of the people who compose it and listen to it over centuries.
Absolutely. The social and cultural reality reflected in the text is invaluable, regardless of the historicity of the core battle.
What about authorship? The source mentions charioteer bards initially.
Yes, the suttas. Originally, it seems, these oral poets, often attached to warrior lineages, were the ones composing and reciting these heroic tales. They traveled with the warriors, chronicled their deeds.
But then there's a shift.
It appears so. Over time, particularly from around the 5th century BCE onwards, Brahmanas seem to have taken over the custodianship and composition of the epic, eventually committing it to writing.
Any idea why that shift happened? Was it linked to political changes?
Very possibly. This period, remember, is when you see larger kingdoms emerging from earlier chiefdoms and tribal polities, right in the region where the epic story is set. Maybe new rulers wanted their lineages legitimized, their histories recorded in a more permanent, perhaps more prestigious Sanskritic form.
Interesting.
It could also reflect broader social transformations, maybe the increasing influence of Brahmanical norms and their efforts to integrate heroic traditions into their worldview during a time of growing social complexity.
And the text just ballooned from there.
Dramatically. The estimates suggest it grew from maybe under 10,000 verses originally to the massive 100,000 or so we have now.
So huge chunks were added later.
Definitely. Major additions seem to have happened between roughly 200 BCE and 200 CE. This is when you see, for instance, the incorporation of Vishnu worship and the identification of Krishna as an incarnation of Vishnu becoming central. And then even later, between about 200 and 400 CE, even larger didactic sections were added, including material that's very similar in and content to texts like the Manusmriti.
It's like this cultural sponge absorbing things over centuries, and the whole vast compilation is traditionally attributed to one sage, right? Vyasa.
That's the tradition, yes. Attributed to the sage Vyasa, who is also a character within the epic itself.
A text that contains its own author. Okay, can archaeology give us any other perspectives, any connections or contrasts? The source mentions excavations at Hastinapura.
Yes, the work by B.B. Lal in the 1950s. Hastinapura is, of course, named in the epic as the capital of the Kuru kingdom, the center of the conflict. And the archaeological site is located in Uttar Pradesh, in the right geographical area.
So suggestive. What did Lal find there?
Well, he found evidence of occupation going back quite far, through different archaeological levels or phases.
And what did the settlements look like in the period that might correspond to the sort of earlier layers of the epic story, say before 600 BCE?
The evidence from that period, what Lal called Period 2, roughly 12th to 7th centuries BCE, indicated fairly simple settlements. Houses made of mud or mud brick, sometimes with walls of wattle and daub, reeds plastered with mud. No signs of large-scale urban structures from that time.
Okay. And later periods?
Later levels, Period 3, roughly 6th to 3rd centuries BCE, show more developed settlements. Use of burnt bricks, evidence of drains, ring wells, features associated with growing urbanization in that era.
Right. Now, how does that compare to the way the epic describes Hastinapura? I think the source quotes something like, it was bursting like the ocean packed with hundreds of mansions.
Exactly. The epic paints this picture of a magnificent, thriving, incredibly grand city. The archaeological evidence, especially for the earlier period often associated with the core story, reveals something much more modest.
So quite a mismatch. What does that discrepancy tell a historian?
It forces us to be critical readers of the text, doesn't it? Several possibilities. Maybe the grand descriptions in the epic reflect the reality of a later period, perhaps when the epic was being compiled and expanded after the 6th century BCE, when more substantial urban centers did flourish in that region. Or maybe, as the source itself suggests, it was partly poetic fancy. An idealized, perhaps exaggerated description meant to evoke grandeur and importance, not necessarily intended as a literal architectural blueprint of the city at a specific historical moment.
So for you listening, this is a great example of why historians love comparing different types of evidence. Texts in archaeology don't always tell the exact same story, and when they diverge, it's not a failure, it's actually an opportunity to ask deeper questions about the nature of the sources, about memory, about idealization, and about how the past gets represented.
Absolutely. It keeps us honest, keeps us from taking any single source, textual or material, as the whole truth.
Okay. Let's shift focus now from the sources themselves to what they tell us about the basic building blocks of society. Starting with family. Seems simple, universal, right? But families are incredibly varied.
They really are. They differ hugely across cultures and time periods and size. Who counts as family, the structure of relationships, the activities they do together.
But some common threads. Shared food, resources.
Living together, working together, participating in rituals together. And families are almost always part of larger networks. Kinfolk, clans, The terms used in the text are often jaki or kula, and lineage, tracing descent, often called the vamsha.
And we often think of family ties as natural, based on blood. But the source makes a good point. These ties are also heavily socially defined. Think about how different cultures define who counts as a cousin or adoption or stepfamilies.
Exactly. The definitions are culturally constructed. Now, a challenge for historians is that our best textual sources often focus on elite families' royalty, wealthy brahmanas. Getting a detailed picture of the family life of ordinary people, farmers, artisans, that's much harder.
But why study attitudes towards family and kinship at all?
Because these attitudes, these beliefs about how families should be structured and how kin should relate to each other, they profoundly shape people's actions. And collective actions over time can actually reshape those very attitudes and norms. It's a dynamic relationship.
And right at the heart of the Mahabharata's conflict is a struggle rooted in precisely these kinds of kinship dynamics, specifically related to inheritance and the idea of patrilineal.
Yes, patrilineal. That system where descent, inheritance, and lineage are traced through the male line, from father to son to grandson. The epic central story, that intense rivalry between the Kauravas and Pandavas within the Kuru lineage. It's fundamentally a conflict over who gets to inherit the land and the power within that patrilineal framework.
And the climax of the story, the great battle, ends with the Pandavas victorious. And what happens then?
Patrilineal succession is explicitly proclaimed and reinforced. The epic's narrative resolution powerfully validates the ideal of patrilineal.
So, under this system, sons were crucial. They were the ones who inherited the father's resources, his property, his status, and in royal families, the throne.
That was the ideal, and it seems to have been widespread. Most ruling dynasties from around the 6th century BCE onwards claimed to follow this pattern of patrilineal succession.
Claimed to. So reality wasn't always perfectly aligned.
Well, practice could vary. Sometimes a ruler might not have any sons. In such cases, a brother might succeed, or perhaps another male kinsman. Very, very rarely, women might exercise power. We mentioned Prabhavati Gupta in a previous deep dive, but that was exceptional. Usually, men inherited power.
So the ideal was strong, but circumstances could force deviations. And this concern with patrilineal wasn't just for rulers, was it? It shows up in other texts, too.
Oh yes, it's deeply embedded in ritual texts as well. The Rig Veda, which dates back to maybe 1000 BCE, contains mantras used in marriage ceremonies that clearly reflect this focus. The source gives us a really telling example.
Let's hear that mantra again. I free her from here the father's house, but not from there the husband's house. I have bound her firmly there, so that through the grace of Indra she will have fine sons and be fortunate in her husband's love.
Now, for you, the listener, really think about what that mantra emphasizes. What is the primary expectation being placed on the bride as she moves from her father's lineage to her husband's?
It's explicitly about producing sons, fine sons.
Exactly. Ensuring the continuity of the husband's lineage. The implications for the bride leaving her natal home, being bound to her husband's, her primary role defined by procreation, specifically of sons, are quite different from the implications for the groom.
It's a ritual text, making the social goal of the marriage very explicit within that patrilineal context. And the epic itself, the Mahabharata, gives us stories that show the tensions around patrilineal, particularly Duryodhana's jealousy. The source mentions that Adi Parvan excerpt.
Yes, that passage really lays bare the anxieties. Remember, Dhritarashtra, Duryodhana's father, is blind. So his younger brother Pandu initially becomes king. When Pandu dies, Dhritarashtra takes over as regent because the princes are young.
But the people prefer the Pandavas.
Right. The citizens see the Pandavas as more virtuous, more fit to rule. And Duryodhana becomes deeply jealous and fearful. He worries that because his father Dhritarashtra was initially bypassed due to his blindness, maybe the lineage will now pass permanently through Pandu's sons, the Pandavas.
He fears being excluded from the succession.
Exactly. If the Pandavas consolidate their claim, Duryodhana and his own sons will be sidelined, losing their potential inheritance of the kingdom.
That story, whether it describes a real historical event or not, tells us so much about the attitudes towards succession, lineage, and inheritance that were clearly important to the epic's composers and audience. It reveals that deep-seated fear of losing status and power if your branch of the patrilineal doesn't inherit. And notice, too, even within these passages, you can sometimes find conflicting ideas about what constitutes right conduct or legitimate claims.
It shows the authors were grappling with the complex human emotions and political motivations driving these power struggles. Now, while sons were highly valued for continuing the patrilineage, daughters were viewed quite differently when it came to inheritance.
Generally, they had no claim on the resources of their father's household, right?
That was the general rule according to many texts. And a key practice related to daughters was marrying them outside of one's own immediate kin group or lineage. This is called exogamy.
Marrying out.
Right. And this practice, combined with the importance of lineage, meant that controlling and regulating young women, especially in high-status families, became very important. Families wanted to ensure their daughters married at the right time and, crucially, to the right person, someone who would form a suitable alliance and maintain the family's status and lineage purity.
And this led to the idea of kanyadana.
Yes, the belief that kanyadana, the gift of a daughter in marriage, was an essential religious duty for a father. It framed the daughter's marriage not just as a social arrangement, but as a sacred obligation.
Okay, let's quickly recap those terms. They're important. Exogamy, marrying outside your group, like lineage or gotra. Endogamy, marrying within your group, like caste, community, sometimes even close kin, like cousins.
Yeah.
Polygyny, one man having several wives. And polyandry, one woman having several husbands, which, incidentally, also features prominently in the Mahabharata with Draupadi.
Good to keep those clear. And it's important to remember that these marriage rules and ideals were developing and being codified during a period of really significant social change. We mentioned the rise of new towns earlier.
Right, bringing people from different backgrounds together.
Exactly. That created a more complex social environment where older beliefs and practices were sometimes questioned or didn't quite fit the new realities.
And how did the Brahmanas respond to this complexity?
Well, one response was to try and systematize social norms more rigorously. They began composing detailed social codes in texts like the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras, starting perhaps around 500 BCE. The Manusmriti, probably compiled between 200 BCE and 200 CE, is one of the most famous and influential examples.
And what did these texts claim?
The Brahmana authors of these texts typically claimed that their rules had universal validity, that they were based on ancient tradition or divine will, and that everybody should follow them.
But as the source keeps reminding us, the reality on the ground, probably more complicated.
Very likely much more complicated. We have to consider the vastness of the subcontinent, the diversity of regional cultures, the practical difficulties of communication and enforcement. It's highly improbable that these Brahmanical norms were universally known, let alone universally applied or accepted, especially in the early period.
And interestingly, even these prescriptive texts, the Dharma Sutras and Shastras, seem to acknowledge that other practices existed, right? By listing those 8 forms of marriage.
Exactly. They categorize the first 4 forms as good or approved, suggesting they align with Brahmanical ideals. But they also list another 4 forms, which they label as condemned.
The Manusmriti excerpt, source 3, gives us a few examples. The first form, the father gives his daughter, decked with ornaments, to a learned man. The fourth, the father honors the groom and addresses the couple, basically giving his blessing. The fifth, the groom gives wealth to the bride's family and the bride herself, essentially a form of bride price. And the sixth, described simply as a voluntary union arising from mutual desire.
Now, for you listening, look at those descriptions again. Think about who is making the decision in each case. Who seems to have the agency? Is it the father, the bride, the groom? The dynamic shifts.
The first 2 seem very father-controlled. The fifth involves the groom actively giving wealth. The sixth sounds, well, based on the couple's choice.
Right. This variation reveals different levels of control and consent. And the fact that the texts even list the condemned forms tells us that these other ways of forming unions existed. They were likely common practices among groups who didn't follow, or perhaps weren't even aware of, the stricter Brahmanical social codes, even if the authors of the Dharma Shastras disapproved of them.
It's a fascinating window into the diversity that existed alongside the attempts to create a single uniform system. Let's dig into one very specific Brahmanical rule about marriage and lineage. The Gotra system.
Okay, so from quite early on, perhaps around 1000 BCE, Brahmanas developed this system of classifying people, particularly themselves, into different gotras. Each gotra was named after a mythical Vedic seer, a sage from the distant past.
And everyone in the same gotra was considered
Descendants of that particular founding seer. Now, this system came with 2 absolutely key rules regarding marriage. First, women, upon marriage, were expected to give up their father's gotra name and adopt their husband's gotra. Second, marriage between members of the same gotra was strictly forbidden.
So it enforced gotra exogamy. You had to marry outside your own gotra. And the wife essentially joined her husband's lineage group, signified by taking his Gotra name.
That was the Brahmanical ideal, yes.
So how can historians figure out if people actually followed this ideal in practice?
One very useful type of evidence comes from inscriptions, especially from ruling families where genealogies or names are sometimes recorded. The Satavahana rulers provide a really compelling case study here. They ruled in western India and the Deccan region for several centuries, roughly from the 2nd century BCE to the 2nd century CE.
And their inscriptions give us clues.
They do. They often mention the names of rulers and sometimes their mothers or wives, including lineage or Gotra affiliations. The source highlights names like Gautamiputra and Vasithiputra.
Right. Gotami and Vasithi are the feminine forms of Gotra names, like Gotama and Vasista. So Gotamiputra literally means son of Gotami.
Exactly. And for you, look at source 4, you can see several rulers identified this way, using metronymic, a name derived from their mother. Raja Gautamiputra Siri Satakani, Raja Vasithiputra Siri Pulumai.
Okay, identifying through the mother's line is interesting in itself, but how does this connect to the Gatotra rules? Does it show a departure?
It absolutely does in a couple of really significant ways. Firstly, these inscriptions strongly suggest that many Satavahana queens kept their father's Gotra name, like Gautama or Vasisa, after they got married. They didn't adopt their husband's Gotra name, which directly contradicts that key Brahmanical rule.
So the wife wasn't necessarily losing her natal Gotra identity upon marriage.
It seems not. At least not in terms of how they were named or identified in these official records. And secondly, the inscriptions reveal something even more striking. Cases where women from the same Gotra married into the Satavahana ruling family. Sometimes a ruler might even marry a woman from his own Gotra.
Wait, marrying someone from the same Gotra? That completely violates the rule of Gotra exogamy.
Precisely. It points towards the practice of endogamy, marrying within the kin group, or at least within the Gotra, being practiced by this major ruling dynasty. This might have served to consolidate power within a close-knit community, a practice known to be prevalent in parts of South India, like forms of cross-cousin marriage.
Wow. So the Satavahana case is a really powerful example. It shows a major ruling dynasty, sometimes interacting with Brahmanical culture, yet clearly not following core Brahmanical rules about Gotra and marriage. They had their own practices.
It's crystal clear evidence that the prescriptive texts, like the Dharma Shastras, do not provide a complete or universally accurate picture of historical reality. Regional traditions and practices often diverge significantly.
Okay. And just briefly, that use of metronymics, Gautamiputra, Vasithiputra, does that tell us that mothers were especially important or powerful in Satavahana society?
It's a tempting conclusion to jump to, isn't it? The names certainly highlight the mother's lineage and identity. However, we need to be a bit cautious about automatically equating that with direct political power for the mother herself.
Why the caution?
Because succession to the throne among the Satavahanas still appears to have been generally patrilineal, passed down through the male line. The metronymic might have been used more to emphasize the prestige and status of the mother's family lineage, perhaps as a way for the ruler to bolster his own legitimacy or connections, especially if his mother came from a prominent family.
So it highlights the importance of maternal kinship ties, but not necessarily maternal rule.
That seems a more nuanced interpretation. Though, of course, mothers could certainly be figures of influence and authority within the family context. Source 5 gives us that poignant example of Gandhari advising her son Duryodhana just before the great battle.
Right. She pleads with him, doesn't she? Urges him towards peace.
She does. She emphasizes wisdom, self-control, rejecting greed and anger. She tells him explicitly that war brings no good, no law, dharma, and profit, ortha, let alone happiness, nor is there necessarily victory in the end. It's powerful advice.
Which Duryodhana completely ignores, leading to his downfall.
Exactly. But for you, the listener, consider what that passage suggests about how mothers could be perceived. Gandhari isn't just making an emotional appeal. She's offering reasoned counsel, linking peace to fundamental political and ethical concepts like dharma and artha. It suggests a recognition, at least within the epic's narrative, of a mother's potential wisdom and moral authority.
It certainly presents her as a figure whose advice should have carried weight, even if it wasn't heeded in this tragic case.
Definitely.
And before we move on from family structures, just a quick thought for you listening. How does the way children are named in your own society today compare to these ancient practices we've discussed, like using metronymics or Gotra names? Are there any echoes, any similarities, or are things completely different now?
Yeah, it's always interesting to make those cross-cultural, cross-temporal comparisons.
All right, let's zoom out now from the family unit to look at broader social divisions in early India, particularly the concept of caste, or more specifically, the Varna system.
Yes, the Varna framework. This is the system presented in texts like the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras as a divinely ordained hierarchical structure. It posits four main categories, or Varnas,
The four Varnas, everyone learns these. Brahmana is at the top.
claiming origin from the mouth of the primeval cosmic being, Purusha, followed by the Kshatriyas, the warriors and rulers, supposedly from his arms, then the Vaishyas, the farmers, herders, and traders, from his thighs.
And finally, the Shudras at the bottom, originating from his feet, whose duty was to serve the other three.
That's the ideal model. And the absolute key principle here, according to these texts, was that your Varna, your place in this hierarchy, was determined solely and irrevocably by birth.
And intrinsically linked to this hierarchy was the idea of prescribed occupations, right? Varna, Dharma.
Yes. The text meticulously laid out the ideal or proper occupations for each Varna. Brahmanas were supposed to study and teach the Vedas, perform sacrifices, and get them performed for others, and give and receive gifts.
Kshatriyas.
Their roles were warfare, protecting the people, administering justice, studying the Vedas, though not teaching them, getting sacrifices performed, and making gifts.
Vaishyas.
They also had Vedic study, sacrifice, and gift-giving duties, but their specific economic functions were agriculture, pastoralism, and trade.
And the Shudras.
Their sole prescribed duty was service to the other three higher Varnas, a very clear, almost rigid division of labor and social function laid out as the divine plan.
And the Brahmanas, who benefited most from this hierarchy, had specific strategies to try and establish this model as the accepted reality, didn't they?
The source points out three main ones. First, and perhaps most importantly, they constantly asserted the divine origin of the system, usually referencing that Purusha Sukta hymn we'll get to. This made the hierarchy seem natural, inevitable, and religiously legitimate.
Hard to argue with divine will.
That was the idea. Second, they advised kings to actively enforce these Varna norms within their kingdoms, using the power of the state to maintain the social order.
Give it teeth.
Exactly. And third, they tried to persuade people more generally that their status and position in society were genuinely determined by birth, that this was just the way things were meant to be.
But establishing this wasn't always easy or automatic, presumably, so they used stories to reinforce these ideas.
Yes. Narratives, like those found in the Mahabharata and other texts, often serve to illustrate the importance of adhering to Varna Dharma, or the consequences of violating it.
And that most powerful justification, the divine origin story, came from that specific hymn in the Rig Veda, the Purusha Sukta. Source 6 quotes the key verse again.
The Brahmana was his mouth, of his arms was made the Kshatriya, his thighs became the Vaishya, of his feet the Shudra was born.
Now, for you listening, think about why Brahmanas would quote this particular vat so frequently. What makes it such a powerful piece of ideological justification?
It anchors the entire social hierarchy, not just in human custom or tradition, but in the very act of cosmic creation. It makes the Brahmas' top position seem like a fundamental aspect of the universe, ordained by the gods, making it incredibly difficult to challenge on religious grounds.
It links their social claims directly to the most ancient and sacred Vedic traditions. Very effective. However, just as we saw with family norms, the actual social reality often seems to have bumped up against this idealized framework. There were challenges.
Definitely. The story of Drona and Ekalavya from the Adi Parvan of the Mahabharata, source 7, is a really striking and rather troubling example of this tension.
Now, remind us of that story. Drona is the master archer, a Brahmana.
Right, and he's the teacher of the Kuru and Pandava princes, who are Kshatriyas, training them in warfare as befits their Varna. Then Ekalavya approaches him.
Ekalavya is from the Nishadas.
Yes, described as a community of forest-dwelling hunters. He's clearly talented and eager to learn archery from the great master Drona, but Drona refuses him. He refuses him explicitly because of his background, his jati or community. Ekalavya is not a Kshatriya, and the specialized knowledge of advanced warfare, according to Drona's adherence to Varna Dharma, is not meant for him.
But Ekalavya doesn't give up.
No, he's incredibly determined. He goes off, makes a clay image of Drona, treats it as his guru, and practices relentlessly on his own. And he becomes an exceptionally skilled archer.
So skilled that his actions reveal his talent.
Yes. The famous incident where he encounters the Pandava's hunting dog barking, and he shoots arrows into its mouth in such a way that it silences the dog without injuring it. An incredible feat of archery.
This gets back to Drona.
It does. The Pandavas, especially Arjuna, Drona's star pupil, are amazed and find Ekalavya. He identifies himself as Drona's student. Arjuna then reminds Drona of his earlier promise that Arjuna would be the greatest archer in the world, unrivaled.
And Drona feels compelled to act.
He does. He goes to Ekalavya and says, "If you are indeed my pupil, you must give me my fee, my guru Dakshina."
And he asks for
Ekalavya's right thumb.
the thumb, crucial for drawing a bowstring effectively.
Exactly. And Ekalavya, embodying the ideal of unquestioning devotion to one's guru, immediately cuts off his thumb and offers it to Drona. He loses his exceptional speed and skill. Drona's promise to Arjuna is technically kept. Arjuna remains potentially unrivaled.
That's a harsh story. For you, the listener, what messages might this story have been intended to convey? To communities like the Nishadas, perhaps it reinforced the idea that even exceptional talent couldn't overcome birth-based restrictions on access to certain types of knowledge or high-status skills.
And for Kshatriyas like Arjuna, it might have validated their privileged access to elite warrior training and status. But think also about Drona's actions. He's a Brahmana, supposedly upholding Dharma. Was his initial refusal based solely on birth, and then his demand for the thumb to deliberately cripple a talented archer? Was that consistent with the higher ideals of fairness and conduct also found in the texts?
It raises difficult questions about the application of Varna rules.
The story seems designed, from the perspective of those upholding the Varna system, to illustrate the perceived necessity of maintaining those boundaries between Varnas and their associated knowledge domains, even when faced with extraordinary individual merit from someone outside the designated group. It prioritizes the social order over individual potential.
And what about that other key rule? Only Kshatriyas should be kings. Did reality stick to that prescription?
Not really, no. The source highlights several examples where ruling lineages clearly had different origins. The Mauryas, for instance, who founded one of India's largest early empires. Their origins are debated. Buddhist texts often describe them as Kshatriyas, but some Brahmanical texts label them as being of low or non-Kshatriya origin.
And even more clearly,
The dynasties that immediately succeeded the Mauryas, the Shungas, and the Kanvas, they were actually Brahmanas.
so Brahmanas ruling as kings, directly contradicting their own prescribed Varna Dharma of being priests and scholars, not rulers and warriors.
Precisely. And this underlines a really crucial historical point. Political power in ancient India often depended much more on practical factors, the ability to muster resources, build military strength, forge alliances, gain popular support, rather than solely on being born into the Kshatriya Varna as the text dictated. Birth might have provided legitimacy, but it wasn't always the determining factor for gaining or holding power.
Other groups challenged the model too, right? Like rulers from outside the traditional Indic sphere.
Yes, groups like the Shakas, who came from Central Asia and established powerful kingdoms in northwestern and western India around the early centuries CE. Brahmanical texts often refer to them using terms like mutchas,
Meaning,
barbarians, foreigners, outsiders basically, people not part of the established Varna system or Sanskrit culture, as perceived by the Brahmanas.
yeah, these militia rulers weren't necessarily ignorant of Indian traditions.
Far from it. The most famous Shaka ruler, Rudradaman I, who ruled in the 2nd century CE, commissioned a major inscription at Junagadh. And it's written in quite sophisticated Sanskrit. It details, among other things, his efforts in repairing the Sudarshana Lake, a significant public work.
So even rulers labeled as outsiders were clearly engaging with, participating in, and even patronizing Sanskrit cultural traditions. They were becoming integrated into the Indian political and cultural landscape, though perhaps on their own terms, not neatly fitting into the Brahmanical Varna categories.
It shows a complex process of interaction and assimilation, and the Satavahana ruler, Gautamiputra Sirisadakani, provides another wonderfully complex, almost contradictory example of this dynamic integration.
We keep coming back to the Satavahanas. What did he claim?
Well, he made several fascinating, seemingly conflicting claims in his inscriptions. He described himself as a unique Brahmana, Eka Brahmana.
A Brahmana king again.
Yes, and not just any Brahmana, but also one who destroyed the pride of Kshatriyas. So, asserting his own superiority over the traditional warrior class. He also claimed to have stopped the mixing of Varnas, thereby presenting himself as an upholder of the traditional Varna order.
Okay, so unique Brahmana, better than Kshatriyas, protector of Varna purity.
But at the very same time, we know from other evidence that he entered into a marriage alliance with the family of Rudradaman, the Shaka ruler we just mentioned, someone considered a mucha, an outsider, by Orthodox Brahmanas.
Wow. So he claims to stop the mixing of Varnas, but marries into the family of someone considered outside the whole system.
Exactly. And remember our earlier discussion. The Satavahanas also frequently practiced endogamy, marrying within their kin group or gotra, which went against the Brahmanical recommendations for high-status groups like Brahmanas, who are supposed to practice gotra exogamy.
Okay, so for you, the listener, that Satavahana example really encapsulates the complexity, doesn't it? They claim a high Brahmana identity, defying the Kshatriya king ideal. They claim to uphold Varna purity, you'll marry outsiders. They follow marriage practices like endogamy that contradict Brahmanical rules. It shows that identity, power, and social practice were incredibly fluid and constantly being negotiated. People weren't just passively following textual rules, they were actively shaping their place in the world using a mix of claims and actions.
It's a fantastic illustration of how complicated the interplay between textual ideals and lived reality could be.
Now, besides the four Varnas, the texts often use another term for social categories. Jati. How does jati relate to varna? Is it the same thing?
It's related but distinct. Like Varna, jati in Brahmanical theory was also generally understood as being based on birth. You were born into a specific jati. But there's a key difference. While the Varna system had a fixed theoretical number of 4 categories, there was no restriction on the number of jatis.
So potentially hundreds or thousands of jatis.
Exactly. Jati seems to have been a more flexible, perhaps more practical category used by Brahmanical authorities when they encountered new social groups that didn't fit neatly into the 4 broad varnas.
Like who?
For example, forest-dwelling communities like the Nishadas we met in the Ekalavya story. Or people practicing specific crafts or occupations that weren't easily mapped onto the general duties of Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, or Shudras. Think of specialized artisans like goldsmiths, Savarnakara, weavers, potters, etc. These groups were often classified as distinct jatis.
So jati was a way to incorporate the immense actual diversity of communities and occupations across India into a framework that was still, at its core, based on birth.
That seems to be how it functioned in the texts, yes. A way of organizing and hierarchizing the complex social reality they encountered. And sometimes jatis based on a shared occupation organized themselves into guilds or shrenis.
Guilds of weavers, merchants, artisans.
Exactly. Now, we often have very limited information about the internal histories or social dynamics of these numerous jatis or shrenis. Texts usually mention them in passing. But occasionally we get lucky with sources like inscriptions. The Mandsaur stone inscription from the 5th century CE, source 8, provides a rare and incredibly valuable glimpse into the life of one such guild.
Ah, yes, the famous inscription about the Guild of Silk Weavers.
That's the one. It's remarkable because it doesn't just mention the guild, it records its history. It tells us how this group of silk weavers originally lived in Latha, which is in modern-day Gujarat.
And they migrated.
Yes, they heard about the virtues of the local king in Mandsaur, called Dashapura in the inscription, in modern Madhya Pradesh, and decided to migrate there as a group, along with their families and kin.
That tells us something about collective identity and mobility right there. What else does the inscription reveal, especially regarding occupations in Varna?
This is where it gets really interesting and challenges the idea of rigid Varna occupation links. The inscription explicitly states that while their collective identity was rooted in their shared craft silk weaving, the members of this guild didn't only practice weaving.
They did other things.
Yes. The source highlights this clearly. Some members became skilled in music, others were interested in telling stories, perhaps poets or bards. Some engaged in religious discourse, some studied astronomy, and some even took up arms and became warriors.
Wow, that's a huge range of activities for people identified primarily as silk weavers. So for you listening, think back to the prescribed Varna Dharma. Was silk weaving or music or astronomy or fighting specifically listed as the sole occupation for one Varna?
Clearly not. Weaving might fall under crafts potentially associated with Vaishyas or perhaps even Shudras, depending on the specific context and text, but certainly not warfare, Kshatriya, or astronomy and religious discourse, potentially Brahmana. This inscription is powerful proof that, in practice, people belonging to a single occupational group or shati could and did engage in a much wider, more fluid range of economic, cultural, and even martial activities than the neat categories of the Dharma Shastras would suggest.
It shows a complex reality where occupational identity, community affiliation, Jatishrani, and diverse individual talents and pursuits all intersected.
Absolutely. And their shared identity wasn't just about their original profession either. The inscription also records that they collectively pooled their wealth, earned through their various activities to build a magnificent temple dedicated to the sun god. This shows a strong sense of shared community and purpose beyond just economics.
That's a fantastic insight. The source also gives other examples that blur the lines, like merchants, vaniks. Technically, trade was a Vaishya occupation according to the Shastras.
Right. But other texts complicate this. The famous Sanskrit play Mikshakika, the little clay card, probably from around the 4th century CE, features a hero, Charvadatta, who is explicitly described as both a Brahmana and a merchant, Savaha.
A Brahmana merchant.
And another inscription from the 5th century CE refers to temple donors as Kshatriya Vaniks, Kshatriya merchants.
So, again, clear evidence from different sources showing that the boundaries between Varna categories and actual occupations were often much more permeable and flexible in reality than the prescriptive texts imply. People from different Varna backgrounds engaged in trade.
Exactly. The social and economic landscape was dynamic.
Okay, so we've seen the Varna system, the Jadatis, the guilds. But there were also populations considered entirely outside this Brahmanical framework, weren't there?
Oh, definitely. The Indian subcontinent has always been incredibly diverse. There were many communities, particularly those living in forests or remote areas or nomadic groups, whose social structures, beliefs, practices were largely independent of or existed alongside Brahmanical norms.
How did the Sanskrit texts, written mainly from the Brahmanical perspective, view these groups?
Often, not very positively. They are frequently described in ways that portray them as other, as odd, uncivilized, sometimes even animal-like. Forest dwellers who subsisted on hunting and gathering, like the Nishadas we discussed, are one example. Nomadic pastoralists whose lifestyle didn't fit neatly into the settled agricultural framework valued by the texts were another.
And people who spoke different languages.
Yes, people speaking non-Sanskritic languages were often lumped together under that label Machida, barbarian, or foreigner. These labels serve to create distance and often justify exclusion or hierarchical ranking.
But despite these dismissive labels and the perceived cultural distance, was there interaction, sharing of ideas?
There must have been. It's almost impossible for groups living in proximity not to interact and influence each other, even if the dominant texts don't fully acknowledge it. And sometimes hints of this interaction surface even in the mainstream texts, like the Mahabharata.
The source mentions the story of Bhima and Hidimba as an example, source 9.
Right. Remember, the Pandavas are in the forest during their exile. They encounter the Rakshasas, who are described in fearsome terms, often as man-eaters. A Rakshasa woman, Hidimba, is sent by her brother to capture the Pandavas for food.
But she falls in love with Bhima.
She does. She transforms herself into a beautiful human form and approaches Bhima, expressing her desire for him. Bhima is initially hesitant, and he ends up killing her brother Hidimba. But Hidimba persists, appealing to Kunti, Bhima's mother. She makes a powerful statement, saying she has forsaken her friends, her dharma, and her kin, all for Bhima.
So she's choosing Bhima over her own community and ways.
Yes, and eventually Yudhishthira, the eldest Pandava, agrees to let Bhima have a temporary union with Hidimba, on the condition that he returns after a son is born. They do have a son, Ghatotkacha, who later becomes a powerful warrior fighting alongside the Pandavas.
Now, historians often interpret terms like Rakshasa in these contexts, not necessarily as literal monsters.
Right. It's more likely a label applied by the Brahmanical tradition to groups whose social practices differed significantly from their own norms. Things like, perhaps, different dietary habits, hence the man-eating trope, different courtship rituals, different forms of marriage or social organization might have led to them being classified as Rakshasas, as radically other.
So for you listening, think about the elements in that Bhima Hidimba story. What seems non-Brahmanical based on the norms we've discussed. The very idea of a man-eating community, the woman, Hidimba, actively initiating the courtship and proposing marriage, the seemingly accepted practice of a temporary union, these all suggest practices that fall outside the strict framework described in the Dharmashastras.
It shows the epic incorporating narratives about groups perceived as different, even while sometimes framing those narratives through the lens and terminology of the dominant culture. It hints at interaction and even integration, albeit on complex terms.
But maybe the most extreme form of social division, the sharpest boundary, was the classification of certain groups as untouchable.
Yes. This concept represents a further intensification of hierarchy and exclusion, going beyond even the four Varna system. It was fundamentally based on notions of ritual purity and pollution.
Purity and pollution. Explain that a bit more.
Certain activities, particularly those associated with Brahmanical rituals like Vedic sacrifice, were considered inherently pure. Conversely, tasks involving handling dead bodies, human or animal, dealing with bodily waste, or working with materials considered impure, like leather, were deemed polluting.
And the people who perform these tasks?
They were themselves considered permanently polluted or impure. They were placed outside and below the four varnas, at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. Their touch, and in some extreme interpretations even their sight, was believed to contaminate members of the pure higher varnas, requiring elaborate purification rituals. The Chandalas are the most frequently cited example of a group designated as untouchable in the texts.
And the texts laid down incredibly harsh rules for them.
Extremely harsh. The Manusmriti, for instance, prescribes specific duties and restrictions for Chandalas. They had to live outside the main village or town. They could only possess discarded items, broken pots, old clothes. They had to wear clothes taken from the dead and ornaments made of iron, not precious metals. They were forbidden from walking around in villages or cities at night. They were assigned the task of disposing of the bodies of criminals or those who died without relatives, and they often served as executioners.
A life defined by segregation and association with death and impurity. And do we have evidence that these rules were actually enforced?
We do have some corroborating evidence from external observers, particularly the accounts of Chinese Buddhist pilgrims who traveled to India. Faxian, who was here around the 5th century CE, described seeing people he identified as untouchables having to strike a piece of wood, like a clapper, as they entered marketplaces, specifically to warn others of their polluting approach so people could avoid them.
And Xuanzang later.
Yes, Xuanzang in the 7th century CE also noted that groups like executioners and scavengers were forced to live outside the city walls and were marked in ways that segregated them. These accounts from foreign travelers suggest that these extreme forms of social exclusion based on notions of pollution were practiced, at least in some of the urban centers they visited during those periods.
It's a grim picture. But did the people subjected to this degradation just accept it? Did they internalize this view of themselves?
That's a crucial question, and it's harder to answer definitively because most of our texts come from the dominant groups. However, historians actively look at non-Brahmanical sources, like Buddhist or Jain texts, to see if they offer different perspectives. Sometimes the depictions in these texts align with the Brahmanical view of Chandala, poverty, and impurity. But occasionally you find stories that hint at different social realities or offer powerful critiques and forms of resistance against this imposed status.
The Matanga Jataka, a story from the Pali Buddhist canon, source 10, is cited as a powerful example of such a challenge.
It really is. It tells the story of the Bodhisattva. The Buddha, in a previous life, being born as Matanga, the son of a Chandala living outside the city of Benares, Varanasi.
And he has an encounter that highlights the prejudice.
Yes. One day he goes into the city and encounters Dithamangalika, the daughter of a very wealthy merchant. She sees him, is utterly repulsed, and cries out that she has seen something inauspicious. Her attendants then beat Matanga severely.
How does Matanga respond?
He doesn't just accept it, he stages a protest. He lies down at the door of her father's house and refuses to move for 7 days. Eventually, to resolve the situation, and perhaps out of embarrassment or social pressure, her family gives her to him.
They just hand her over.
That's how the story goes. He takes her back to the Chandala settlement. But the story doesn't end there. Matanga later decides to renounce the world, becomes an ascetic, and through his spiritual practice gains immense psychic powers. He then comes back, and despite their vastly different origins, marries Dithamangalika.
So, a Chandala marrying a high-status merchant's daughter through his spiritual attainment. That's already challenging norms.
Absolutely. And they have a son, Mandavya Kumara. This son grows up, studies the 3 Vedas, becomes very learned in Brahmanical knowledge, and gains high status himself, daily feeding 16,000 Brahmanas.
He seems to have assimilated into the high-status world.
Completely. Then one day, his father, Matanga, comes to his house dressed in rags, carrying a begging bowl, seeking alms from the very feast his son is hosting for the Brahmanas.
How does the son react?
Mandavya is horrified and ashamed. He completely rejects his father, calling him an outcast, a degenerate Chandala, and tells him the food is reserved for Brahmanas, not for someone like him.
And Matanga's response is key here.
It's the philosophical core of the story. Matanga delivers this powerful rebuke, saying essentially that pride in birth, combined with ignorance, despite Vedic learning, makes one unworthy of receiving gifts. True worthiness, he argues, comes not from birth, but from being free from vices, from moral purity and spiritual attainment.
A definition of worth based on conduct, not caste.
Exactly. The son, Mandavya, is enraged by this challenge to his status and throws his father out. But Matanga then uses his psychic powers to ascend into the air, demonstrating his superior spiritual state. Seeing this, his wife, Dita Mangolka, the son's mother, realizes the truth and seeks forgiveness from Matanga.
That's a remarkable story. For you, the listener, what elements clearly suggest this narrative comes from a perspective that fundamentally challenges the dominant Brahmanical view of caste and untouchability?
Well, the whole premise, right? A Chandala achieving enlightenment and immense spiritual power. The explicit critique of birth-based pride, ignorant despite Vedic learning. The stark contrast between the supposedly learned son who embodies prejudice and arrogance, and the supposedly low-born father who embodies true wisdom and detachment. And crucially, Matanga's redefinition of worthiness based on ethical conduct and inner purity, directly refuting the idea that birth determines inherent value or dictates one's spiritual potential.
It seems designed to subvert the entire ideology of birth-based hierarchy and untouchability from a Buddhist ethical standpoint.
Precisely. It offers a potent counter-narrative, arguing that spiritual and moral qualities are what truly matter, not the accident of birth into a particular varna or jati.
So this leads to a really important question for you to ponder as you think about all these sources we've touched upon. Which sources seem to support or describe people generally following the prescribed Brahmanical norms about varna and occupation? And which sources suggest that there were many other possibilities, widespread deviations, challenges, and alternative realities existing on the ground?
You really see both sides, don't you? You see the constant effort to promote the ideal, but the evidence for flexibility, negotiation, and outright difference is just pervasive throughout the sources when you read them critically.
Okay, moving beyond the structures of varna and jati, let's consider another fundamental factor that shaped social position and created differences: access to resources, wealth, land, property.
Absolutely crucial. Whether someone lived as a slave, a landless laborer, a peasant proprietor, a hunter-gatherer, a wealthy merchant, or a king, their place and power in society were profoundly influenced by their access to and control over material resources. And importantly, this access was often sharply divided along the lines of gender and varna that we've already discussed.
Let's look at gender and property first. That dice game episode in the Mahabharata, it's just unforgettable and deeply unsettling. Source 11, Yudhishthira, the epitome of Dharma, gets drawn into this disastrous dice game.
And he loses everything, systematically. His wealth, his kingdom, his brothers, even his own freedom, becoming a slave. And then, in a final desperate throw, he stakes Draupadi, the common wife of all 5 Pandava brothers, and he loses her too.
So for you listening, does this pivotal episode suggest that wives could, in some sense, be treated as the property of their husbands, something to be gambled away like cattle or gold?
It's a deeply troubling question raised by the text itself, and Draupadi's own fierce challenge afterwards is key. She asks the assembly, "Did Yudhishthira lose himself first, or me?" In other words, could a man who was already unfree, who no longer owned himself, have the right to stake another person?
And the text doesn't give a clear answer, does it?
No, it presents conflicting arguments from different elders in the assembly, and the issue is left unresolved, debated. The very ambiguity, the fact that this question is raised so powerfully and left hanging, is significant. It shows this was likely a point of real tension and debate within the society that produced the epic questions about a woman's status, her rights, her relationship to her husband's property and person.
The legal texts, the Dharma Sutras and Shastras, try to offer a clearer, though perhaps more idealized, picture of property rights.
They do. The Manusmriti, for example, lays down rules for inheritance. It generally states that the paternal estate land, wealth accumulated by the father, should be divided equally among his sons after the death of both parents. Sometimes the eldest son might get a slightly larger special share.
And women.
Crucially, according to Manusmriti, women were explicitly excluded from claiming a share of this primary paternal property. It was inherited through the male line.
However, there was one category of property women could own, right? Stridhana.
Yes, Stridhana, literally, woman's wealth. This typically referred to the gifts a woman received at the time of her marriage, gifts from her own family, her husband's family, or her husband himself, often in the form of jewelry, clothing, or sometimes even cash or servants.
And this was considered her personal property.
Generally, yes. The text suggests she had control over her Stridhana, and it could be inherited by her own children, particularly her daughters. Her husband usually had no legal claim over it, although some texts suggest he might be allowed to use it in times of extreme family distress, with her permission ideally.
But even this ownership might have had limits.
It seems so. Manusmriti also contains warnings advising women against accumulating family property independently or even hoarding their own valuables without their husband's permission. So even the control over Stridhana might have been subject to patriarchal oversight in practice.
So while we know from other evidence, like inscriptions mentioning Queen Prabhavati Gupta making land grants, that some elite women certainly could and did control significant resources, the overall picture painted by the legal texts and supported by much of the inscriptional evidence suggests that control over the major means of production land, cattle, significant amounts of money was predominantly concentrated in the hands of men.
And this unequal access to fundamental economic resources was undeniably a major factor in creating, reinforcing, and sharpening the gender differences and hierarchies within the social structure.
Source 12 provides a really stark illustration of this difference by listing the prescribed ways men and women could acquire wealth, according to Manusmriti. Let's look at those lists. For men, it lists 7 means.
Inheritance, finding something valuable like treasure, purchase, conquest through warfare, investment, making wealth work, actual work or labor, and receiving gifts from good people.
Okay, quite a range, including active acquisition. Now, for women, it lists 6 means.
Gifts received before the marriage fire from her family, gifts received during the bridal procession as she moves to her husband's house, gifts given as a token of affection, perhaps by her husband or in-laws, gifts received from her brother, mother, or father, any subsequent gifts received after marriage, and gifts from an affectionate husband.
Now, for you listening, compare those 2 lists side by side. What immediately jumps out?
The difference is striking, isn't it? The men's list includes active means of acquiring wealth through effort, risk, and enterprise conquest, investment, work. They are portrayed as agents of wealth creation and accumulation. The women's list, in stark contrast, is almost entirely passive. It consists almost exclusively of receiving gifts from male relatives or her husband.
It paints a picture of significant economic dependency being codified in the legal norms.
It really does. It's a clear snapshot of a prescribed economic order where women's independent ability to acquire and control substantial wealth is severely limited compared to men's.
And Varna, the caste category, also played a major role in regulating access to property and wealth, according to these same Brahmanical texts.
Yes, definitely. As we discussed, the Dharmashastras generally confine Shudras to the role of service, which implicitly limits their opportunities for independent wealth accumulation through means like land ownership, large-scale trade, or high-status professions. The upper 3 Varnas, Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas were theoretically permitted a wider range of occupations and thus supposedly had greater opportunities to acquire wealth.
So, based purely on these texts, you would logically predict that the wealthiest members of society would overwhelmingly be Brahmanas and Kshatriyas.
And indeed, other sources often seem to align with this general picture. Narratives frequently depict kings, presumably Kshatriyas and high-ranking priests or advisors, Brahmanas, as being wealthy and powerful, although it's also acknowledged in some stories that poor Brahmas existed too.
But as we've seen repeatedly, other traditions offered critiques of this neat Varna-based order, particularly Buddhism.
Yes, Buddhism, which arose around the 6th century BCE, right in the midst of this period of social change, consistently challenged the Brahmanical idea that social status was natural, divinely ordained, or rigidly fixed by birth. Buddhists recognized social differences, of course, but they argued against the inherent inequality claimed by the Varna system.
And a story from the Majjhima Nikaya, a Pali Buddhist text, source 13, provides a brilliant illustration of this Buddhist critique, particularly focusing on the power of wealth versus birth. It's framed as a dialogue between a king, Avanputta, and Kachana, a prominent disciple of the Buddha.
The king starts by reciting the standard Brahmanical claims. Brahmanas are the best caste, the highest, fair in color, pure, born from Brahma's mouth, the rightful heirs, the standard justification.
Kachana then poses a very practical, almost hypothetical question to the king. He asks, what if a Shudra, someone from the lowest Varna, were to become very wealthy? If he acquired significant resources, wealth, corn, gold, or silver, could such a wealthy Shudra then command the services of people from any of the 4 Varnas? Could he have servants who were other Shudras, or Vaishyas, or Kshatriyas, or even Brahmanas?
A pointed question challenging the hierarchy. And how does the king respond?
The king has to admit, perhaps reluctantly, yes. A Shudra who possessed great wealth could indeed employ servants from all 4 Varnas. He could have obedient attendants who were Shudras, Vaishyas, Kshatriyas, and Brahmanas.
And then Kachana delivers the logical conclusion, the core of the Buddhist argument. This being so, then, are not these four Varnas exactly the same?
The king is forced to concede that, yes, on this count, on the practical ability to command service and obedience based purely on economic power, there is actually no difference between the Varnas.
So, for you, the listener, what does this story really highlight about social difference? It powerfully suggests that, regardless of your prescribed birth status or Varna, wealth could be the decisive factor in determining your actual power, your ability to command others, and how people interacted with you in the real world. The Buddhist text uses this pragmatic observation to directly undermine the rigid, birth-based hierarchy claimed by the Brahmanas, arguing that economic class could effectively override Varna distinctions in practice.
It's a clear argument for the significance of economic factors intersecting with, and sometimes even trumping, the theoretical Varna structure. A very different perspective. So while wealth could certainly reinforce existing inequalities based on Varna and gender, it could also, as that Buddhist story implies, create alternative power dynamics. But was status always just about accumulating wealth? Were there other models?
That's a great question. Accumulation wasn't the only game in town. In some regions and contexts, status was derived not just from having wealth, but from being generous with it, from sharing it.
Like in ancient Malakam.
Exactly. In the ancient Tamil region of South India, around 2,000 years ago, the social landscape was characterized more by chiefdoms than large kingdoms following strict Brahmanical norms. And these Tamil chiefs often gained prestige and loyalty by patronizing bards and poets who sang their praises.
And the Tamil Sangam literature, those collections of classical Tamil poetry, gives us insights into this world.
Yes, Sangam poetry provides a fascinating window into the social and economic relations of that time and place. It certainly shows differences between the rich and the poor, but it also reveals a strong cultural expectation that those who possessed resources, particularly chiefs and warriors, should be generous and share them, especially with poets, bards, and their followers. Generosity was a key marker of status and virtue.
Source 14 gives us a poem from the Purananuru anthology that seems to capture this ethos perfectly. The bard is describing a chief.
And he says the chief isn't someone who has so much wealth that he can just lavish gifts on others every single day, implying his resources might be somewhat limited or variable. But crucially, nor does he have the pettiness to say that he has nothing. He might not always have abundance, but he's not mean-spirited. He's praised effusively as an enemy to the hunger of bards. High praise indeed in that context.
And the poem then describes how the chief might acquire the resources needed to be generous.
Yes, the bard encourages other hungry poets to seek out this chief. He tells them, if you go and show your poverty, the chief will turn to his blacksmith and command him. Shape me a long spear for war, one that has a straight blade.
So for you listening, what strategies is the bard using here? He's using flattery, praising the chief's known generosity, appealing to his reputation, and subtly prompting him to act. And how is the chief expected to get the wealth he needs to share?
Through warfare. He needs a spear for battle. The implication is clear. The chief will engage in raids or warfare to acquire resources, cattle, booty, land, specifically so that he can then distribute them to his followers, including the bards who sing his fame.
This reveals a really different value system compared to, say, the accumulation-focused model implied in some other texts, or the rigid occupational roles of the Varna system. Here, status isn't just about birthright or how much wealth you passively hold. It's deeply connected to active generosity, the ability to provide for your dependents, and even the willingness to acquire resources through potentially violent means for the specific purpose of sharing and maintaining your following through patronage.
It's a social model where the circulation and redistribution of wealth play a much more central role in defining a leader's status and legitimacy, quite distinct from merely owning land or belonging to a high Varna by birth.
Yet another layer showing the diverse ways social standing was understood, performed, and maintained across different regions and cultural contexts in ancient India.
It really underscores the complexity.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly and look at a fundamentally different way of explaining the origins of social differences and political authority itself. An alternative to that Brahmanical idea of divine origin from the Purusha Sukta. This is the Buddhist concept of a social contract.
Yes, this is a fascinating counterpoint found in Buddhist texts, specifically mentioned in the source as coming from the Sutta Pitaka, source 15. It offers a completely different origin myth for kingship and social hierarchy.
How does the Buddhist myth begin? Not with a cosmic being.
No, it starts with human beings in a kind of primordial idyllic state, living in harmony with nature, taking only what they needed, without strong notions of private property or greed, a state of relative peace and simplicity.
But this didn't last.
According to the myth, no. This state of natural harmony gradually deteriorated. Humans became increasingly greedy, possessive, and deceitful. They started taking more than they needed, leading to theft, conflict, and a breakdown of social order.
So problems arose from human nature, from flaws like greed and anger. And how did they respond? How did they create order out of this chaos?
This is the crucial part. According to the Buddhist myth, the humans collectively decided they needed someone to regulate society. Someone who could be wrathful when indignation is right. Someone to censure wrongdoers, and if necessary, banish those who seriously violated the norms. They recognized the need for an authority figure to maintain order.
So they chose someone.
Yes, they chose a being for this role. Someone distinguished by his virtue or capabilities, whom they called the Mahasamata, which means the great elect, or the one chosen by the whole people.
And what was the agreement? What was the contract between the people and this chosen ruler?
The people agreed to give this chosen person a proportion of the rice, essentially, a share of their produce, a form of taxation in return for the service of maintaining order, administering justice, and providing protection.
Now, for you listening, really think about the implications of this origin story for kingship and social order. What does it suggest?
It's radically different from the divine right model. It implies that the institution of kingship is not based on divine appointment or inherent superiority derived from birth, like being born from Brahma's arms. Instead, it's presented as something created through human choice and mutual agreement.
The ruler is essentially a public servant.
Exactly, a
Yeah.
paid service provider. He receives taxes, the proportion of rice, in exchange for performing necessary functions for the collective good of society. His authority derives from the consent of the governed, not from divine mandates.
And the wider significance of this myth.
It's profound because it emphasizes human agency. It suggests that social and economic systems, including political institutions like kingship, are not immutable, divinely ordained structures. They are human constructions created by people in response to specific social problems like greed and conflict.
And the implication of that.
If humans create this system, then theoretically humans also have the capacity to change it, to modify it, or perhaps even to abolish it and create something different if it ceases to serve its purpose or becomes unjust.
That stands in stark contrast to the birth-based, divinely fixed hierarchy presented in the Purusha Sukta and reinforced in the Dharmashastras. It offers a completely different philosophical foundation for understanding social order, seeing it not as a rigid cosmic law, but as a potentially malleable human arrangement that evolved historically.
It provides a basis for a fundamentally different perspective on hierarchy, inequality, and the potential for social transformation. A very radical idea for its time.
It's amazing how many threads lead back to the Mahabharata in this discussion. And the source reminds us, quite rightly, that this epic is a truly dynamic text. Its life, its influence, its evolution didn't just stop when the Sanskrit version was compiled.
Not at all. That was just one stage in a much longer journey. Over the centuries that followed, the epic was retold, adapted, and translated into countless versions in numerous languages right across the Indian subcontinent and even into Southeast Asia.
So this wasn't just a matter of straightforward translation.
No, it was much more creative and interactive than that. This ongoing process was like a continuous dialogue between different regions, different communities, different generations of writers, performers, and audiences.
Stories or themes that were important locally found their way into regional versions of the epic.
Exactly. Local traditions, folk narratives, specific interpretations, they were often woven into the fabric of the epic as it was retold in a particular linguistic or cultural context. And the central narrative itself, the core story of the cousins' conflict, was constantly being reinterpreted, with different characters or episodes emphasized or understood in new ways.
And its influence went way beyond just written or oral literature, right?
Oh, absolutely. Episodes, characters, and themes from the Mahabharata permeated visual arts, sculpture, painting, manuscript illumination, and they became central subjects for a vast and diverse array of performing arts, classical and folk theater, dance forms, puppetry, oral storytelling traditions that continue even today. It saturated the cultural landscape.
So for you, the listener, this underscores a really critical point about using creative literature like the Mahabharata as a historical source. It doesn't necessarily provide a literal photographic snapshot of social reality at any single moment. You can't just read it as a factual report.
Definitely not. But by looking at its stories, its internal debates and contradictions, its vast number of variations across time and space, and its endless adaptations in different art forms, We gain incredible insight into the attitudes, the values, the concerns, and the ways that different societies grappled with complex social issues, with norms, with conflicts, with ethics. It reveals the social imagination at work over millennia.
And this dynamic engagement with the epic continues right into the modern era, doesn't it? Often through critical retellings that question or reframe parts of the traditional narrative.
Yes, absolutely. The source mentions the work of the acclaimed contemporary Bengali writer Mahashweta Devi and her powerful short story, Kunti O Nishadi, Kunti and the Nishadi Woman. She takes a specific, often glossed over incident from the original Mahabharata and uses it to offer a profound critique.
Which incident is that?
It's from the Adi Parvan, the first book. It relates to Duryodhana's treacherous plot to kill the Pandavas by housing them in a palace made of highly flammable lac, intending to burn it down while they slept.
But the Pandavas are warned and plan their escape.
Yes, they dig an escape tunnel. But to cover their tracks, to make everyone think they perished in the fire, Kunti, the Pandavas' mother, does something quite chilling. She hosts a feast before their escape. She invites some local brahmanas, but also, crucially, an Ashada woman and her 5 sons.
The forest-dwelling community again.
Yes. Kunti encourages them to eat and drink heavily. They fall into a drunken sleep inside the lax house. The Pandavas then set the house ablaze and make their escape through the tunnel. When the charred bodies of the Nishada woman and her 5 sons are discovered in the ruins, everyone assumes they are Kunti and the 5 Pandavas. The plan works.
And the original Sanskrit text. How much detail does it give about this Nishada family?
Remarkably little. They're essentially anonymous, unnamed plot devices. Their role is purely functional, to provide the necessary corpses to make the Pandavas' escape convincing. Their lives, their identities, their fate, they're treated as incidental, expendable.
And this is where Mahashweta Devi focuses her retelling.
Exactly. That silence, that casual sacrifice, is precisely what Mahashweta Devi interrogates. Her story is set many years later, after the great Kurukshetra war is over. An elderly Kunti, now living in the forest, is reflecting on her long and often difficult life. She encounters an old Nishadi woman.
And this Nishadi woman reveals.
She reveals that the unnamed Nishada woman killed in the Like House fire all those years ago was her mother-in-law, and the 5 young men were her brothers-in-law. She then confronts Kunti directly. She says something to the effect of, "You, Kunti, have spent years meditating on your past, your sorrows, your sins, your dharma. But did you ever spare a thought for the 6 innocent lives that were deliberately extinguished simply so that you could save yourself and your own 5 sons?"
Wow, that's an incredibly powerful accusation, turning the narrative completely on its head.
It is. Mahashweta Devi takes this moment of silence, this marginal detail in the grand heroic narrative, and gives it a voice, a history, a devastating human cost. She forces the reader, and Kunti, to confront the ethical implications from the perspective of the marginalized, the unnamed victims whose lives were sacrificed for the greater good of the epic heroes.
It becomes a story about class, about who is considered disposable, about the limits of empathy across social divides, and about how history looks profoundly different when viewed from the margins rather than the center.
Precisely. It's a conscious literary act of reclaiming a narrative, of challenging the dominant perspective, and posing difficult questions that resonate far beyond the ancient epic.
So, for you listening, this example shows how the Mahabharata isn't just an ancient artifact. It remains a living text, a source not just for repeating traditional stories, but for ongoing dialogue, for critique, for exploring the complexities of power, justice, and social responsibility that continue to challenge us across different times and cultures.
It demonstrates the enduring power of these foundational stories to provoke critical thought and challenge our assumptions, even thousands of years later.
While we have certainly taken a deep dive today, we've sifted through quite a stack of rich, often complex sources, using the Mahabharata as a kind of central thread to explore kinship, caste, and class in early Indian societies over that long period from 600 BCE to 600 CE.
We really covered a lot of ground. We saw the ideals, didn't we? The ones laid down in texts like Manusmriti, that strong emphasis on patrilineal, the carefully prescribed rules around marriage like Gotra exogamy, the vision of a neat, hierarchical Varna system with its fixed occupations.
The blueprint, so to speak. But then we saw again and again that the reality on the ground seems to have been far more nuanced, often quite different. We saw practices like endogamy and women retaining their Gotra names among the Satavahanas undermining the Brahmanical rules. We saw the formal recognition of multiple marriage forms, some quite contrary to the ideal.
We saw the reality of non-Kshatriya kings holding power, challenging the idea that only warriors could rule. We saw the fluidity of occupations within jatis, like those Mandsaur silk weavers who are also poets and soldiers, defying neat Varna categorization. And we saw the power of wealth sometimes overriding birth-based status, as argued in that Buddhist story about the rich Shudra.
And we looked at the often difficult position of groups placed outside or at the very bottom of the Brahmanical system. Forest dwellers like the Nishadas, those deemed untouchable like the Chandalas, facing harsh restrictions and prejudice.
Yet even within those narratives of marginalization, we found stories, like the Matanga Jataka, that offered powerful challenges to the dominant ideology, proposing alternative ways of valuing people based on conduct and inner worth, not birth.
We also saw how access to resources, often sharply divided by gender and Varna, played a huge role in shaping social differences and reinforcing inequalities. Those contrasting lists of how men and women could acquire wealth, and the disturbing implications of the Mahabharata's dice game episode really highlighted that.
And importantly, we also encountered alternative frameworks for understanding social order and status altogether, like the Tamil ideal, where generosity and the sharing of wealth were paramount for leadership, or that fascinating Buddhist idea of a social contract, where political authority arises from human choice and collective need, not divine decree.
I think the biggest takeaway for me is just the sheer complexity. Early Indian society during this long and formative period clearly wasn't a single, uniform, static system operating according to one set of rules.
Absolutely not. It was a dynamic, diverse, often contested space. There were dominant ideals being promoted, yes, but also constant variations, local adaptations, conflicts, and ongoing negotiation between those overarching traditions and the myriad realities of lived experience across the subcontinent.
And the sources themselves reflect all of this complexity, don't they? Which is why historians have to approach them so carefully.
Exactly. You can't just read one type of text in isolation. You have to work like a detective, piecing together clues from multiple perspectives, comparing prescriptive texts with narrative ones, comparing Sanskrit sources with those in Pali or Tamil, bringing in archaeological evidence, looking at inscriptions, trying to build a more complete, more nuanced picture from all the available fragments.
It's a challenging but fascinating process. And it leads me to a final thought, picking up on that Buddhist social contract idea we discussed. If, according to that ancient line of thought, social order, political structures, even hierarchy itself were originally things created by human beings.
Yes.
Yeah.
Created in response to human problems like greed, conflict, the need for cooperation.
If that's the case, if social systems are ultimately human constructions, what does that imply about our own ability right here, right now, in our own time, to critically examine the social structures we live within, the inequalities, the injustices, the problems they generate?
If social order was seen as a human creation back then, isn't it still fundamentally a human construction now, made and remade through our actions, choices, and institutions?
And if it is a human construction, what does that ultimately say about our collective capacity, maybe even our responsibility to change it, to reimagine it, to build something different if the current structures aren't working fairly or effectively?
That is indeed a thought worth considerable reflection. A powerful question to leave hanging.
Indeed. Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. We hope you found exploring these ancient complexities as thought-provoking as we did.